Shalom and welcome to Contextual Bible Study. My name is Denny Thompson, and today we're going to look at part 2 of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, a couple different terms there I'd like to look at for a second because this relates to today's presentation. First of all, the word kesher, which simply means connection. And the rabbis of Jesus' day, and actually still to this day, use connections all the time. So they will use a text in a teaching that is reference to a previous text, in this case from the Old Testament. So a lot of the New Testament teachings, in fact almost all of them, are connected back to the Old Testament. That's called a kesher. And the second term I have here is called stringing pearls, and that's kind of a rabbinic idea. And Jesus used all these, that's why this is important. That's the idea of connecting a whole series of texts, a whole series of ideas to paint a picture. And that's really what's going on in this Good Samaritan parable on a very, very large scale. So let's get back into it. And if you remember, we had the priest and the Levite had come by. And the third person is going to come by. And of course, the audience is fully expecting it to be a Jew, kind of a progression from a priest to a Levite, kind of going down in terms of status, to just a regular Jew. But that's not what happened. Jesus said, "But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was." Wow. Okay, that had to be shocking to the audience. A Samaritan, I can just hear them. They probably were talking among themselves. Can you believe what this rabbi just said? But a Samaritan, for those who are listening in on this, of course, would have been absolutely shocking. The reaction would have been very courageous for him to tell this to a Jewish audience, to even say that in one respect. In addition to being shocked, the hero of the story is really the most hated group of all, the Samaritans. This Samaritan is likely a merchant, probably traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, because we know he's going down on that road. He has a donkey, he has wine and oil, so he's likely a man of some means. We can kind of surmise from some of these details. Now, as a Samaritan, he did not recognize the Jerusalem temple in its ritual impurity rulings. Okay, remember that conflict, that great conflict. We went over this in previous teachings between the Jerusalem temple and Mount Gerizim, the temple that was once up there. We know very little about him. Really, truthfully, we don't even know the direction he's traveling. We kind of assume he's going down, but it's actually possible he was going up. And in the case of the parable, he's going to reverse his travel if that was the case. As we have learned, there was a great animosity, and that's putting it lightly, between the Samaritans and the Jews. This man would have learned all about the history and conflicts with the Jews from the time he was a little boy. So he was well aware of this, obviously, of this conflict. So, and that makes what's going to happen here that much more amazing. Back to the text, back to the parable. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and he bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. He does what the priest and Levi did not do. By showing such compassion at this man's suffering, he would have had the man's blood on him because he had to pick him up and he got right next to him. The Samaritan was not a priest or a Levite, obviously, yet he is the one who acted like one. Now, if we kind of think about the role of priests and Levites being assistants, their duties involve lots and lots of sacrifices and blood and diseases of all types, skin diseases and cleansing. So evidence of a priest on duty, somebody who's involved in all of this, would be their robes would not stay white. The robes would get dirty, they'd get soiled, they'd get stained, they'd get blood on them. And what was interesting is I've studied up on this and learned that actually they would, when the robes got not usable, completely dirty, they would cut them in pieces and use them for wicks in the menorah to still burn for God's glory. And I found that kind of interesting. Now, if we only imagine these vast number of sacrifices that they were engaged in, we can just get an idea what that must have been like. It was really quite something. And again, once they've engaged in their priestly duties, that was not all glamorous by any stretch. To honor God in this way, the way he instructed, involved great dedication on their part. Now, this New Testament verse 1 Peter 2:5. I forgot the colon there, I can see, but 1 Peter 2:5 is this: you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Now, we don't wear white robes, but kind of metaphorically speaking, if we are engaged in the world, we're not doing sacrifices and skin diseases and things like that. But for our engagement in the world would look different for all of us. But that means to maybe to minister to somebody who's really, really hurting, or to deal with somebody who's very hard to deal with, whom we maybe get called names as a result of trying to work with them. Maybe things aren't working out like we think they should, and yet we're engaged. We're trying to do what God wants us to do. Kind of metaphorically speaking, our robes, in a sense, kind of get dirty if we're really fully engaged. It's going to be sometimes very, very, very difficult, as we know. But if our robes are white, that means we maybe aren't engaged, and maybe we're not engaged in the world and living out the kind of life Jesus told us. So it's kind of a picture there. Okay. Now, he cleaned the man's wounds with his own wine, applied oil to soften them, and then he bound them. Now, he might have probably, in fact, it's likely he tore his own clothing, because the parable tells us that the victim was naked. Since it's unlikely he had bandages. So he's doing all this to try to help this poor man. Then he put the man on his donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. Now, putting the half-dead man on his own donkey meant he walked. Now, in that culture, a servant always leads the donkey with the master riding. And obviously, this Samaritan had no concern about that. He wasn't worried about that at all. He just wanted to help this poor man. Now, inns usually were at the entrance to town. So this is modern-day Jericho beneath here. So in ancient Jericho, there would have been an inn right on the edge of town. That's normally where they put them. Inns had very notorious reputations. A lot of times the people that staying there were not maybe the best people to be around, or even the innkeeper himself. So they really did not have real great reputations. It's a little bit different idea than what we picture today of a hotel. It would be expected that the Samaritan man would leave the wounded man at the edge of the Jewish city of Jericho out of concern for his own safety, because if it become known he's a Samaritan, well, he could be in serious, serious trouble. The text tells us, though, the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Now, this little detail, the next day, what does that mean? Well, that means he spent the night. So obviously he's not going to worry about, his own safety here. He wants to stay and spend the night to make sure everything is set. Now, that's interesting. At great risk, obviously, bringing in a wounded Jew, such a rough place. He could be blamed for this even. So he had a lot to think about here, but apparently he didn't worry about it because he spent the night. It took great courage to stay here. He didn't just drop him off, but he stayed, showing great compassion. So that's a detail that's important to the story. The next day he took out 2 denarii, as I said, and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expenses. Now, 2 denarii. Well, one of them, here's one picture to the right there, as you can see. That would be from that time period. But for 2 denarii, that was enough for 24 nights. Because we've learned that from history that it took 1/12 of a denarius, singular, for the rent for one night. So he gave him enough money, giving him 2 for 24 nights total. It appears the Jericho innkeeper knows him, since he trusts him to return and pay the rest of the bill. Generally, these innkeepers had bad reputations, as I mentioned. This indicates that the Samaritan was likely a businessman who had frequently traveled this road. He maybe even knew the innkeeper. I think maybe it's almost likely he knew him. So this idea that compassion, it starts with help and rescue, but then there's another step here demonstrated by this parable. The next step is much more involved. It involves, in this case, financial and restoration. So there's another level to just this entry level, and this Samaritan is showing this. We do not know what happened to the Samaritan, since the parable does not say. Jesus did not indicate. Was he harmed? Was he killed? Did he return to his home village in Samaria? Did he go back to Jerusalem? So, Jesus asked the question, which of these, of course, of these means the priest, the Levite, and now the Samaritan, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? He's asking this question to the lawyer. Now, rabbinic tradition is when you bring a question to a rabbi, to another rabbi, you are bound by his answer. But his answer then was another question, as we just heard right there. So the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. He couldn't even say the word Samaritan. Okay? He had to say the one who had mercy on him, the expert in the law did. Because that term was something he couldn't even get out of his mouth. For Jesus, not the identity of the person is important, but clearly the action. Paul wrote this, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Now, the original question, okay, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit life? If you remember, we went over that last time, but that was the original question that he asked. Jesus is going to say to him, he's going to indicate to him, that is the wrong question. Okay, that's what this is all going to be about. He's asking something very selfish. We went over kind of that last week, but this is the wrong question. So you're answering my question with the wrong question. That's how they did things, of course. The right question would have been, who's my neighbor? How do I show my neighbor love? God loves me, and because he loves me, I should love him too. So that would have been the discussion Jesus wanted, and that's what he was showing him gradually throughout this parable. So the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So what happened with the expert in the law? Well, we don't know. We don't know exactly what happened to him because it doesn't tell us. Kind of like in the parable of the prodigal son, we don't know exactly what happened with the older son. We don't know what his final response was. We do to the younger, but not the older. So, and Jesus does this in his parables quite often. I think he's making us think here about maybe us. What about us? What would we do? Okay, by leaving this open-ended in that respect. Now, the term of love, and you shall love, there's a Hebrew word ve'ahavta, and there's a reason I'm showing you this. You'll see in just a second here. It's very important. There's three important uses in the Bible. Okay, and it relates very much to this parable. Now, in this answer right here, remember the expert in law answered. This is called a Shema. Love the Lord your God. That was his answer, with all your heart and with all your soul, and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. He combined a couple uses of love, one right here and one right here. That's ve'ahavta in Hebrew. Now, the first one was this one. It's called a Shema. The reason they call it the Shema was the very first word is hear, O Israel. And here is the word Shema. And very often in Hebrew, the very first word of a statement or a teaching becomes the title. For example, like in Genesis, the book of Genesis, it starts off with in the beginning. And the Hebrew word is Bereshit. So they actually call Genesis Bereshit. So anyway, that's why this is called a Shema. So hear, O Israel. Hear means to hear and obey. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. So that's the first use. And then we have this, second use of ve'ahavta. And do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against any one of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Okay, so Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18, which the expert in law did combine, are two of the three places in the scriptures where ve'ahavta is used. So the rabbis taught this means the two are totally linked, and that linking is called a kesher. They're connected. But there is a third use, and that's this. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you, and you shall love, ve'ahavta again, him as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And who was that stranger? Well, by telling this parable, Jesus seems to be elevating the use of ve'ahavta to the level of the other two, this use right here. And the question is, who is that stranger? Okay, now there's definitely an implied connection of loving a stranger or alien to the Samaritans, but it goes even deeper to the ancient Good Samaritans. Now, follow me on this, because this is really an amazing link here, an amazing Kesher connection Jesus is making. There are many parallel details in the parable we just read to a story we're going to read right now, a short story. And they all knew this because these people are very biblically literate. So they would have made this connection. There's another huge connection Jesus is making in this parable. And this is so very important. All right, to set this up, let's go back to the divided kingdom with Judah in the south, Israel's in the north, and Aram is beyond that. That would be the present day Syria. That's going to be connected to this story. And this is during the time of the period of King Ahaz, who's one of the wicked kings, in this case, of Judah. Back in the book of Chronicles, 28, chapter 28, 1 to 15. Now, King Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. Unlike David, his father, David wasn't literally his father. He was 13th in line from David. He did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He followed the ways of the kings of Israel. And he also made idols for worshiping the Baals. We fell into this total idol worship. Now I want to look at this map in order to look at something else that was happening during this time, during the time of King Ahaz, that was very significant to this story. But this is a kind of an overview of Israel. David's city was the original Jerusalem, okay? So that was kind of on that small ridge, maybe 7 to 10 acres. Now that yellow area was expanded by King Hezekiah, and in Jesus' time period, that was Jerusalem going out that way. So that kind of gives you an idea. But what we're focusing on right now is something called the Hinnom Valley. So see the arrow pointing down to the Hinnom Valley. Something happened there that was really awful in Israel's history. Now, there it is today. That's that valley today. It's called Gehenna in Greek, which means the same as the Hebrew term, the Valley of Hinnom. Okay, that valley right there. Now he, King Ahaz, burned sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom and sacrificed his children in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. Now in this case, King Ahaz and a few other kings had done the same, had copied the practices of the Moabites and used this pagan god, Molech, this horrific looking god, which had arms of blazing fire. Okay, so there's a fire in his arms there that they had ignited. And they would take their babies and put them into that fire, into his arms of fire, and sacrifice them to the gods, to the god Molech. Now you can imagine what God thought of this. And what they would do is sometimes this valley was called the Valley of Topeth. And what that means, that's a Hebrew word that means drums. They actually would play drums in the valley to drown out the sound of these screaming little babies as they're put into these flaming arms. So that's how low they went. Just an incredible thing that happened during this time period of history. So this idea of offering sacrifices and burn incense at high places, or high places that he set up all over Israel, King Ahaz, and a few of the other kings did too, along with many of the kings in the northern part. This is actually the northern part, and it's an example of a high place. This is the town of Dan, and you can see the picture to where the high place was, and then they would have an altar beneath. So that's what was going on. These were pagan places, and they were set up all over Israel. And so these pagan gods were generally set up on these high places where they would worship. Okay, so that's what's happening. Now, the Arameans defeated him and took many of his people as prisoners and brought them to Damascus. Therefore the Lord his God delivered him, King Ahaz, into the hands of the king of Aram. So they are going to be taken, King Ahaz and his people, up here to Aram, to Damascus. Well, something else is going to happen to the people from Judah and King Ahaz. He was also given into the hands of the king of Israel, who inflicted heavy casualties on him. In one day, Pekah, the son of Remaliah, killed 120,000 soldiers in Judah because Judah had forsaken the Lord, the God of their ancestors. Now, Zechri, an Ephraimite warrior, now the Ephraimites, that's Israel, that's the northern kingdom, killed Maaseiah, the king's son, or King Ahaz's son, Zechrim, the officer in charge of the palace, and Elkanah, second to the king. So King Ahaz is going to survive, but Maaseiah and Zechrim will be killed. The men of Israel took captive from their fellow Israelites who were from Judah 200,000 wives, sons, and daughters. They also took a great deal of plunder, which they carried back to Samaria. Now, in this divided kingdom, of course, Judah, Israel, and then Aram to the north, they're going to be taken up this way, Israel. But remember, Israel, the name is going to change, this at least that lower part of it, to Samaria. So that is what Samaria is going to be called. So Israel becomes Samaria, that part of it. But a prophet of the land named Oded was there. This guy is not well known, but he's very important, this prophet. And he went out to meet the army when it returned to Samaria. So he's a prophet in Samaria, in the northern kingdom of former northern kingdom of Israel. He said to them, because the Lord, the God of your ancestors, was angry with Judah for what they had done, he gave them into your hand. But you have slaughtered them in a rage that reaches the heavens. Okay, so he's scolding him based on what has just happened here. And now you intend to make the men and women of Judah and Jerusalem your slaves? But aren't you also guilty of sins against the Lord your God? Now listen to me. Send back your fellow Israelites you have taken as prisoners, for the Lord's fierce anger rests on you. Then some of the leaders in Ephraim, or Israel to the north, confronted those who were arriving from the war because they had listened to what Prophet Oded said, and they took it to heart, and they didn't want to inflame God's anger anymore. You must not bring those prisoners here, they said, or we will be guilty before the Lord. Do you intend to add to our sin and guilt? For our guilt is already great, and his fierce anger rests on Israel. Of course, they were guilty of so much idolatry in the north, probably even more than Judah had. So the soldiers gave up the prisoners and plunder in the presence of the officials and all the assembly. The men designated by name took the prisoners, and from the plunder they clothed all who were naked. Now listen to these details. They provided them with clothes and sandals, food and drink, and healing balm. All who were weak they put on donkeys. So the people from Judah who were captured were now being brought back to Judah. They had listened to the prophet Oded because he was following the directions from God. And what happened is this: they took their fellow Israelites to Jericho, the city of palms, and then they returned to Samaria. There's an implied connection of loving stranger, alien, to the ancient Good Samaritans, to a story they would have known. Many parallel details in the parable and this story in 2 Chronicles. Now, connecting Deuteronomy 6:5 and 19:18, as we mentioned, are two of the three places in the scriptures where the phrase Ve'ahavta and you shall love is used. And the rabbi said they're connected. And of course, the expert in law answered in that way. But by telling this parable, Jesus seems to be elevating the other use of Ve'ahavta to the level of the first two. And it is this: the stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you, and you shall love Ve'ahavta him as yourself. For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And who was that stranger? Well, the story from Second Chronicles took place just after Israel had divided into Israel and Judah. Judah fell into idolatry, extreme idolatry, as of course did Israel, to the extreme of sacrificing their own children. And as a result, God allowed Judah to be attacked and defeated by Israel. The Israelites were on the verge of taking 200,000 Judeans away as slaves when Prophet Oded reminded them that God let them defeat Judah as a punishment for Judah's idolatry. The Israelites, too, were very guilty for worshiping idols. Oded tells them that if they took their own brothers captive, God's anger would be on them. So some of the leaders of the tribes repented and set the captive Judeans free. They gave them clothes and sandals, fed them and gave them drink, anointed them with oil, led their feeble ones on donkeys, and brought them down to Jericho, the city of palm trees, to their brothers. And then they returned to Samaria. Now, Jesus' Jewish audience would certainly have seen the parallels. They were captured, taken away, then eventually taken care of, given clothes and sandals, anointed with oil, put on donkeys, and taken down to Jericho. So these two stories had so many parallel details. It was very, very clear. The divided northern kingdom of Israel, of course, became Samaria. They were the ancient Good Samaritans. Jesus reminds them at one time, these same men from Samaria did one of the most merciful things ever done. They had recognized their sin against the Judeans, realized their enemies were not only their neighbors, but were their brothers. Jesus was saying that our neighbor is even our hated enemy sometimes, who really is our brother in a sense too. So many lessons from this story. Seeing the potential in everyone, just as God does. Knocking down the barriers created by rejection. They, of course, had all kinds of barriers, social barriers, but we do too at times. Not judging, but accepting and loving other people. Seeing the big picture, not getting all upset over small things. And then, after all, our neighbor really is our brother. The heart of Jesus' teachings. But I tell you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. If we really want to show Jesus how much we love him, we will love our neighbor unconditionally, no matter how difficult it is, and that can be very hard sometimes. We need to view everyone with Jesus' eyes. So thank you for watching this conclusion of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Shalom.